in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So, Mike, how long have you been a cop anyway? We're getting pretty old these days.
Yeah, like, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. No, I think we're around 16 years.
16 years. Now, in the military, typically you retire at 20. When do you retire from police stuff?
Yeah, about 20. I
Okay.
mean, if
All
you
right,
want
so-
to, right? Like you can do longer, but you start getting eligible for a... Obviously, every state has their own thing, but like here, for me, it's at 20.
20.
The newer guys, they can't retire till like 25, but for me, it's still 20.
So, what did you do before you were a cop? You were in the Air Force for a period of time, right? And then before that, what'd you do?
For like literally 5 minutes. And then I worked on an ambulance for a while as an EMT.
EMT. And for the listeners who aren't super familiar with life on an ambulance, there's typically an EMT and a paramedic. Can you just explain just real briefly what an EMT versus a paramedic is?
So if you work in that configuration, that varies quite a bit, not only state to state, but even within states. So I worked in Southern California where the county specifically that I worked in had a EMT paramedic configuration for most 911 response stuff. But there were a lot of ambulances throughout like LA County, Orange County that were dual EMT, and the paramedics were only staffed by the fire department. So it just depends on where you're at. But where I was, it was EMT paramedic on an ambulance. And there are also in my hometown now, where I live now, and also in like LA, Orange County, back in California, you would have ambulances that did your advanced life support, your paramedic level stuff, and then you'd have private ambulances that would do your EMT level, your basic life support stuff. And so those were two different levels of care depending on the severity of what was happening. And so in real life terms, what that means is if it's bullshit, like if the person's fine, then they're going to go BLS ambulance, 2 EMTs. And if it's something cool, then they're going to have a paramedic. So I was lucky that when I worked on an ambulance, I worked on an ALS ambulance, and in San Bernardino County where I worked, it was not, we were not only the ALS ambulance provider, but also most of the fire departments didn't have transporting. They didn't have ambulances themselves. So we did all of it. We did everything, whether it was bullshit or not, if it was cool or otherwise, we did all of the transports. And so it got a lot of exposure and experience. In terms of the difference between EMT level care and paramedic level care, paramedic is still an EMT. It's just EMTP, right? EMT paramedic versus EMTB, like EMT basic. And most of the difference has to do with a paramedic can provide certain advanced skills, like they could do more advanced heart monitoring stuff. They can give more medications. They can do some advanced airway things that most EMTs can't do. So,
For example, like cutting an air hole into your throat, right? That's not a thing you would typically see an EMT do.
right, that's more like paramedic
Understand that.
level school. If you had to,
Okay.
if you had to crike somebody, right? Yeah. Do
Yep.
the whole, the old like Bic pin in the trachea.
That's what they taught me at military self-aid buddy care.
Yeah.
Is get the pen in there and like duct tape an ID card onto it. The military loves the idea of duct taping ID cards onto like sucking chest wounds, that kind of thing. It was great.
I'm
I had
sure they
great
do.
training. Yeah. So I'm guessing somewhere in the 16-ish years you've been a cop, and however many years you worked on an ambulance. I'm assuming you've seen some car wrecks.
Couple, yeah.
Like, if you had to put round number, like a couple dozen, couple hundred, couple thousand, couple million, how many car wrecks do you think you come across?
We're easily in the thousands,
Possibly the
range,
millions?
probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it occurred to me, and at least my experience is usually being the person in the car wreck, because I'm a great driver and I've been in a few. It occurred to me that we should probably do an episode on like how to handle a car wreck. And handling a wreck will mean different things to different listeners, right? We've got cop listeners, we have EMT listeners and paramedic listeners, and we have just members of society listeners. We have people who are interested in personal defense and people who are interested in preparation for disaster, that kind of thing. So handling a car wreck will change depending on your role, but everybody who drives in a car should probably know something about how to handle a car wreck, because you're probably going to see one and you might end up in one statistically at some point in your life, right? And then there's the standard stuff, to get control, take a deep breath, call for help. Good thing you have insurance. Hopefully you have insurance, that kind of thing. Get all the data from the other driver, make sure everyone's okay, that kind of thing. But let's consider what a cop going through like the police academy should know about traffic collisions. And let's consider what any civilian who rolls up on a gnarly car wreck should know. Like, there's a lot to consider, especially if you want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And presumably all of our listeners want to be part of the solution, or at least make the problem funnier. I don't know. So car wrecks. Car wrecks are a pretty broad topic. And as I sat down and kind of think about what it is we need to hit, like in one sense, car wrecks are really simple. Cars bang into each other. Hopefully everyone's okay. If they're not okay, do what you can to make them okay. And I'm sure in there's some like scene and traffic management, and someone's going to collect data as part of an investigation if it's serious enough. And I think a lot of people would be surprised how rarely there's an investigation. If you bang cars, often the police won't even respond, or if they do respond, they'll send like a community service officer out, right? That kind of thing.
2024 staffing, all that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Defund the police, right? And eventually someone needs to clean up the wreckage, which usually isn't the cops. It's usually like a tow truck, right? In another sense, this is super complicated. There's a whole field of study dedicated to accident reconstruction, mechanical engineering, vehicle safety, and there's this whole other entire field of trauma care at every level. There's the on-scene, and then there's, back in the hospital with the bright lights and cold steel. And along with the trauma care, if you have a potentially really gnarly mass casualty incident, you got triage, you got evacuation, and there's a rescue aspect. There might be a car on fire. Mike, have you ever seen a car on fire?
Couple. Yep.
Couple. Okay. You might have to extricate an injured, trapped person out of the car. You might have to pull somebody out of a steep ravine, or, get them into a stable position. There might be hazmat. You might have shitty weather. That's often what causes the wreck in the first place, that and looking at cell phones. And you also have like the emotional trauma that honestly I can't do justice to in a podcast. And I don't ever like to say that, because I think there is a lot we can address. But like, understand a gnarly enough car wreck, especially one that has kids or any number of scenarios, is going to be heavy. It's going to weigh on the victims of the wreck. It's going to weigh on the responders. And that is part of the response to a car wreck that we need to address. We need to consider. So tonight we're going to try to hit at least some of all that. And one of my favorite sayings is like, you got to understand the stuff that makes it complicated so that when you need to make it simple, you can make it simple, right? When it's time to do the ABCs, you do the ABCs, or you do the march, or you do the 10 cap or pen cap or whatever Mike's going to tell you about. So that's what we're here for. Mike, what do you got?
Yeah, so when I was in the hiring process to be a cop back in the day, this is when we still did like panel interviews, like oral board processes. Like
back in the day, you don't do them now?
Nope. Growing up, I just always assumed that a job interview would always be a thing, right? And that's
I like that we give like machine guns to cops, and we're like, oh, whatever, it's fine.
Yeah,
I'm sure they're fine.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our hiring standards have changed so much, and staffing has become so critical that we don't even actually do interviews anymore because it's just not competitive enough. I mean, there's still a background investigation, and through that process, you'll be interviewed by somebody. But in terms of like competition and weeding people out, no, it's like
we're not necessarily getting the best and brightest, right?
Right. So anyway, back in the day when we did oral boards, one of the questions that they asked me in my interview was, you're driving back to the police station. It's the end of your shift. It's been a long day, and there's a car accident. What do you do? And I thought this was like a work ethic or integrity thing. Like I thought they were
call
just
911. You're like, no hablo inglés, pero
like it felt like they were asking me if I would just kind of keep going, like put the blinders on. You know, we used to call when I worked on the ambulance, they called it the EMS salute, where you like put your
not my problem,
put your hand over your eyes and like didn't see it. And so I answered pretty simply. I was like, I would do my job like I would any other time. Like I would just do my job. And they're like,
and then
yeah. In my mind, I'm like, that it's been a long day, or my shift, it's the end of my shift. Like that doesn't matter. Like I would just do my job. And they're like, yeah, but like, no, specifically, what would you do? And I'm like, oh. Like, what would I do for a car crash? Got it. Okay. I see where you're going.
You could have just asked that.
Yeah. Now, this was before I was a cop, and I had the EMT experience. I worked on the ambulance, so that helped. But it's also just kind of a basic problem-solving question, right? Like, you're driving down the road and you come across this situation. How do you handle it? It's about what your priorities are and your decision making and how you would navigate those things. I'm like, all right, I can handle this. Like, well, I'll go through this kind of the way I would as an EMT. And speaking of being an EMT, like back in the day when I started as an EMT, we still did ABCs, right? Now you probably heard
that's
March.
Old school. Yeah.
Now you probably hear March, and ABCs is kind of a version of that, right? But back in the day, when we learned that as part of EMT school, it was more complicated than just ABCs, right? There was a whole list of things. And it's actually kind of still like this in a sense, right? When you get tested on your recertification exam for EMT stuff and paramedic stuff, there's this big, long patient assessment like checklist. There's one for medical problems and there's one for trauma. And it's got, I don't know, 50 or 100 things on it. It's actually pretty substantial. It's like 2 pages. If it fits on 1 page, it's because it's like 8-point font. It's like tiny, right?
Real quick, for our listeners who don't understand what's the difference between medical and trauma assumes that there's been an energy transfer. It assumes that somebody has bunked into something or had something poked into them, right? There's an energy transfer when we're talking trauma.
Yeah, versus like a medical emergency would be like your, seizure, stroke, heart attack, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so they had these long lists of things that you had to know. And there's like a minimum number to pass, but there's also like some critical failure points if you don't hit all of them. And these are like the foundation of EMS doctrine when it comes to patient assessment. And part of that for the trauma assessment is also like your scene size up, right? And that's kind of where this relates to looking at like a car accident. If you're an EMT, you're responding to this sort of scene and you're like, oh, okay, there might be hurt people here. As you're starting to make an impression of the problem before you even get out of the ambulance, before you park, right? You're driving up and you're seeing from a distance, is there smoke? Is there fire? Like, is there bodies in the road? Are there people around? Like, is it nighttime? Is it daytime? All those things that come up, right, are all part of your scene size up. But there is one point as it relates to this episode and one of the key messages in this. In my EMS career, I took this class, and it was a pre-hospital trauma life support class that is technically a paramedic level course, but EMTs were allowed to take it because a lot of the trauma stuff, a lot of trauma care, pre-hospital especially, is actually EMT level stuff. So considering that, one of the foundational things that they taught us in this class in PHTLS, which, by the way, the people who write PHTLS are also the same people who wrote TCCC. So if you've heard of that, right, there's like a military tactical version, TCCC or TECC. It's the same people that wrote PHTLS, pre-hospital trauma life support, which is like the more civilian, tame, kind of normal, everyday stuff, right?
TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, assumes people are shooting at you, and I'll give you the Cliff's Notes. The answer is shoot back, win the fight, then work on your buddy, do march. Okay. Yeah.
And there's some, you can unpack that a little bit and say it's not just when people are shooting at you. It can also be like the building or the car is on fire. Medicine changes when scenes are less safe, right? So there's like scene safety, which is like a core component of medical care. But there's also those situations where it's like, well, it's not always safe. But anyway, one of the foundational principles that they taught us in this class is that, this assessment that you're doing is a global assessment. So when they taught us in this case, it was ABCDE, which was very, very similar to March, right? Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, head hypothermia. ABCDE was very, very close to that, right? Airway, breathing, circulation, disability, environment, exposure. So the idea here that they tried to get across to us is it's a global assessment. It's not airway, then breathing, then circulation, A, B, then C. Just like March, there's massive bleeding, and sure, that should get your attention, but it's not necessarily in any particular order. The idea is that like you're focusing your attention on the thing that is drawing it, right? Like whatever draws your attention the most, you go to that first, and then you start working and you use the algorithm to figure out, all right, what am I missing, right? You're looking at the big picture. ABCDE is about, or March, whatever you want to call it, is about looking at all of it and taking it in and then figuring out your priorities. And then when you get lost or you get stuck, you can go backwards and say, all right, I've got this memory device to help me out.
Yeah. If you're not sure, start at the beginning, right?
Right.
The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to slap a tourniquet on, then all the other things. Okay.
So the reason I bring all that up is because when we talk about managing traffic collisions, there's a lot of it depends. And I can't give you a step-by-step algorithm for managing that kind of thing. And so I want anyone listening to this, whether you're civilian first civilian on scene type of thing, or you're a first responder going to this, cop, EMS, fire, whatever, in whatever circumstance that you're in, that you go to this, you have to kind of take in the entire, like the whole picture, the whole situation, right? And it's easy to say that, oh, there's life-threatening injuries. We got to treat those. Yeah, if you see those, right? But if you're on a 2-lane highway, like a mountain road at night, and you might get schmucked by the next oncoming car, that doesn't do anyone any good, right? So there's hazards like that you have to consider. There's also things like downed power lines, or I mentioned earlier, fire. Or if you see life-threatening injuries, but you can't get to the people because they're trapped and they have to get extricated or cut out of the car. So like anything that we talk about on this show, what we need you to understand is that there's a big critical thinking component to this, right? That it requires problem solving, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You have to manage conflicting information, competing priorities, and make decisions that are time sensitive. So I want to tackle that from as many perspectives as we can tonight. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is arm you with some of the information that will hopefully inform those decisions. So one of the sections of that patient assessment form that we got taught back in the day, and this is kind of what helped me answer the question when I got asked in an oral board when I was becoming a cop, was your scene size up section. And the memory device, or the mnemonic that they taught us for that, was Penman.
Penman. Okay.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this when we did a whole episode on trauma care, just kind of a primer. And this is not a medicine episode. And yeah, we did one. We did a medicine episode, but obviously that doesn't replace actually going out and doing training. The best way to learn that stuff isn't listening to a podcast, but rather getting out there and doing it, right?
Yeah. And I want to be clear, anytime we throw a caveat like that, when we tell you can't learn this stuff from a podcast, that's true. There is formal training. But what we can do, what Tactical Tangents does for you, is we help you figure out what training you need, and hopefully we help you get more out of that training by giving you some context and background, right? So that if you see an opportunity to take a PHTLS course, you know what it is, and you know it's a thing you want to go do. Or TCCC, you know what it is. You know, like, why March is such a big deal and why they keep pounding it into you is because, like, this is the why, right? So we're trying to make you more successful in this stuff.
Not only that, but if you have taken some of those classes, hopefully this can reinforce some of that, remind you of it, and put it into context. And second, let's say you're going to go out and get training at some point and you don't learn it exactly this way, it's just another way of thinking about these problems, right? Because it's not like there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. And Penman, I use the Penman scene size up like memory device because it's what I was taught back in the day. But like, there's probably a better one out there, and maybe you learn it a different way. I don't know. Like the point is, it's just another way of thinking about this. And so filter it in however you can, right? So when it comes to identifying some of the priorities, I think this can help. And what I want you to take away from internalizing this isn't to memorize it. I can't think of any time that I walked up to a scene and I was like, okay, Penman, P is first. What are we going to do? Like, I don't use it that way, right? It's more on the front end. It informs my decision-making because these are the questions I'm starting to ask myself. And particularly, most of these problems will become apparent right away, right? Like, you don't necessarily need to know. Like, if you're like, hey, is there an ambulance coming? Is there a fire truck coming? That would be cool. Like, do we need a helicopter? We're in the middle of nowhere. That would be cool.
Yeah.
Those things should be pretty apparent, but this might be something that you can go, all right, what am I missing, right? And the most important thing, I think, in all of this is, like, you have to have some level of detachment, right? See the event happening from the balcony view and ask those tough questions. Like, what's the most important thing right this second? And maybe there's some life-threatening injury, right? Someone's bleeding, and you can control that, and that is the most important thing. But maybe you recognize that if we're out in the middle of nowhere, as an example, without more help and more resources, like a helicopter or whatever else, nothing I do here is going to matter, right? Until I ask for those resources. So, that's kind of the idea. So I think Penman is a good place to start in terms of managing car wrecks for anyone in whatever.
So what is Penman anyway?
Yeah. And that reminds me, like, so speaking of, I mentioned this in terms of EMT stuff, and like, cops have probably never heard of it. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this will blow their mind a little bit. Maybe it's something they can use when they teach new guys. I don't know. Who knows?
Well, you got to make it like a 10 code, right? Yeah. 10 Penman.
Yeah.
That way they'll understand.
That'll definitely help. So Penman, what does it stand for? So I'll go through these. Penman, Penman, right? The first one is P, and that stands for personal or personnel safety. Obviously, your own safety is important if you're a responder to this sort of thing, but also if you're dealing with a big scene, you've also got other people there working the scene that matter. and this is pretty self-explanatory. Personal safety, personnel safety. You're not going to do anyone any good if you don't manage scene safety. And if you become another victim, right, who needs to be rescued, that's problematic. So that's the P. Straightforward. E is environmental hazards. We talked about some of those already. We said down power lines. If you're on the train tracks and there's potentially a train coming, that could be an environmental problem. I mentioned fire earlier. Traffic hazards is a big one, especially at night if you have oncoming traffic to deal with. Inclement weather, just doing things at night in general, if it's dark, can be a problem. Fluids leaking from cars or vehicles, including like if it's a commercial truck or something like that, hazardous materials, those sorts of things. So environmental hazards is the E. N in Pinman is the number of patients. So this is largely like just managing your own attention, right? How many people do I have to deal with? How much can I focus in on one thing versus like, do I need to step back and really triage and manage this? So number of patients. And again, that's going to affect when you call for additional help, how much help you need, right? Depending on how many people are there. M is mechanism of injury. And if you're in a medical context, you would say nature of the illness. But in a trauma case, like a traffic collision, the mechanism of injury is how did the injuries occur? There's a whole field of this. If you were to look into PHTLS, there's a whole field or chapter section called kinematics, and it's all about energy transfer. Jim talked about that earlier, right? So the mechanism of injury, how did the injuries occur in this event, right? This requires looking at the amount of energy involved and your index of suspicion as it relates to the severity. So if you consider that two cars traveling at, I don't know, we'll say 65 miles an hour on the freeway that collide head on, how does the energy transfer happen? And two cars coming head on, right? Another common one would be a T-bone collision. So in a T-bone collision, if you think about like you crash into something with your car and you have the engine block in front of you to kind of pad a lot of the collision, right? Versus all you have is like the skin of the car door and you get T-boned and that car door gets pushed in to where you are. Passenger space intrusion, right? And that can put a whole level of like index of suspicion for like injuries on whatever side you got hit, right? Maybe there's your spleen. Maybe if you're on the right side, your passenger side, there's your liver involved. Like you're looking at things like that to consider how much energy was transferred and where did it go? And that is the mechanism of injury component. Consider especially the things like how much energy does it take to flip a car over? Or I mentioned the head-on collision. Like that's a lot of energy transfer, right? What happens when a motor vehicle strikes a pedestrian or someone on a motorcycle or a bicycle, right? Those are the sorts of factors that should raise your awareness for more serious injuries.
So I want to jump in real quick, just talking about mechanism and kinematics. It is helpful, I think, to understand in a car wreck or any kind of collision, there's really two collisions, right? There's the car bangs into car, and then there's the contents of that car because of momentum and inertia that keep moving until acted upon by some force, right? So car stops suddenly, the humans inside that car stop against hopefully the seatbelt and the airbag. If not, they stop against the steering wheel and the windshield. And by the way, everything that was loose in that car keeps moving. So for example, if you're like, I'm a prepper, I'm going to have my fire extinguisher in the back of my SUV. Well, where do you think that fire extinguisher is going to go when you go from 60 to 0 in under a second? It's going to keep moving unless it's strapped down. So that's a little literary foreshadowing.
Yeah. And there's actually, so Jim mentions the two collisions that happen, which is true. There's the car colliding with the other car or object, and then there's the people colliding with the stuff in the car. There's actually a third that's important too.
Ooh.
And that is you have organs and loose things within your body that is also going to collide. So your brain, for example, is in a container, right? And that can hit stuff. You can have shearing injuries where like major vessels in your body can also get jolted one direction or the other and collide into the insides of your body that can actually cause pretty serious injuries as well. So that's a third type of collision that can happen. And all of those happen. And again, that's why you have to look at what is the mechanism of injury, what's the severity of the energy transfer that happens, because a lot of times you might not see any outward stuff, but you might have to recognize that, like, yeah, he might like look okay right now, but the amount of energy transfer that happened here suggests that there could be some more serious injuries underlying that we're not seeing yet, right? So, PINMAN, so far we've got personal and personnel safety, environmental hazards, the number of patients, mechanism of injury. The A is for additional resources. That can be, if you're the first people on scene and you're off duty, that can be calling 911 to begin with, fire, EMS, law enforcement, whatever. It can also be, if you have down power lines, calling the power company. If you're on train tracks, calling the train people. It might be bringing in helicopters. It might just be bringing in more bodies, right? Like if there's a large number of patients and you need more ambulances, more personnel, might be bringing that in. Hazmat crews, if there's hazardous materials involved. All of those things take time to get involved, so call for them early is the idea, right? Part of your scene size up, as you're rolling up on scene and you're looking at this from the balcony, you're looking at how many people do I have involved? What are the safety and environmental hazards? What's the mechanism of injury? Do I need any additional help? That's the sort of stuff, right? And then the N, the last N, is the need for extrication, which is kind of related to the additional resource. But for some people, like you might be able to do the extrication yourself. It just changes the dynamic and the workload a little bit. Like you might not be focused on patient assessment if you have to get access to the person. And access is important because extrication can mean lots of different things. Like I said, it might be an additional resource. You might have to call for help. But it could also just be that you have to actually get down to the person, right? They went down a cliff or a ravine, right? So part of those extrication or rescue resources could also be technical rescue teams. It could be special equipment that you might need, all of those sorts of things. It kind of fits into additional resources, but I don't know. I guess PINMA doesn't sound as cool as PINMAN, so they needed to fill out that N somewhere.
I like it. I think PINMAN, I think this is great, and I wish I had learned it at some point a long time ago. I want you to consider how this applies differently if you're a cop versus if you're a paramedic versus if you're a civilian who happens to be first on a scene, or if you're one of the people in the wreck, right? You can apply all of these in some way, and they might help shape how and when you call 911, for example, what you say on the radio, what things you tackle as you get out of the car, or if you bother trying to tackle them as you get out of the car. Recognize when you need help, right?
Yeah, and kind of related to this is in EMT land, this is like the beginning stages of patient assessment. It's the very, very top, right? You go from here to general impression, mental status, and ABCs, like your actual like nitty gritty medical stuff, right? But what I like about this as an episode and as a topic when it comes to scene size up stuff is you're trying to take in more than just those like specific little details, right? Like I could teach a monkey how to like put pressure on a wound that's bleeding, right? That's easy. It's that prioritizing stuff. It's the communicating, the coordination, competing priorities, time-sensitive decisions. That's where it gets a little bit more challenging, especially if there's multiple patients. And I certainly don't want this episode to be a deep dive on medical and trauma stuff. But one thing that I do want to point out as it relates to the scene size up stuff is there are scenarios where, let's say it's a bad car accident, right? Serious trauma kind of thing, bad wreck, and you get there and you're first, and you call 911, and you're like, all right, this is what we got. We got a rollover collision down a ravine. There's all these things. There are some things that you can do that might facilitate better medical care outside of doing the medical care yourself, right? And it's things like, let's say, giving good information when you call it in, right? This is the number of patients. This is their severity. And in language that they're going to be like, okay, we're getting actionable intelligence on what's happening on the ground there, right? If there is a scene safety or environmental hazard, for example, maybe it is something that you can do to make it safe. Like, can you evacuate people to a safe location off to the side of the road, for example? Maybe it's cutting off clothes, right? Like, if you know that you're going to have to look for injuries and that this is a serious trauma, if you can start getting clothes out of the way, getting people out of the car, if there's several patients, co-locating them, kind of establishing like a casualty collection point so that when people do get there, they're not bouncing back and forth. Everything's in kind of one spot. Those are the sorts of things that might expedite patient care. Outside of doing patient care yourself, just getting clothes off, getting people co-located, moving them to a safe place, trying to eliminate whatever hazards or environmental stuff there is that might be controlling traffic. And I think that's a big one, is controlling traffic is often the first thing that you do, is preventing more victims, right?
Yeah, more wrecks. One time in Albuquerque, I watched a car plow right into a stoplight. Stoplight landed on the car. And among other things, that was one of the things I needed to tell 911 was now the intersection is shut down.
Yeah, so I think little things like that can help expedite the whole process, and that can be a big deal.
So I want to give you a kind of a basic vignette from the private citizen perspective. So a couple of months ago, I was driving to the airport, like commercial airport, to head out on a work trip. So trying to catch a commercial flight, right? And on the way to the airport, I rolled up on a fresh car accident scene. I was like the first car, second car, something rolling up on this. Now, to set the scene, particularly for new listeners, unlike Mike, I am not a cop. I am not an EMT. I'm a military dude. If that.
Hashtag not a cop.
Yeah, and I have pretty solid first aid training, from things I've been exposed to in my career, but I'm not a medic, right? And I wasn't on base, and I wasn't on duty, and I wasn't in uniform, and not at work, right? In any conventional capacity. So I'm a civilian in this context. And as I see this scene, I didn't want to get out of my car. I didn't even want to stop. I had places to be. I had a plane to catch, right? Normalcy bias and routine and not wanting to get involved, bystander syndrome, right? And so I look across this car wreck scene, and there's a banged up pickup truck on one side of an intersection. I see a sedan upside down with all of its windows shattered out on the other side of the intersection. There was a older person leaning up against the grill of the pickup truck, and there's like a 20 or 30-year-old woman walking around the scene with a young child, 3-4 years old, and the kid was bleeding from the scalp. So that's the scene as I roll up. So question 1, do I have an obligation to stop and help? And I grew up in a family full of lawyers in California, so a natural question on that is, if I do stop, am I going to get sued for trying to help? That comes up a lot. People are like, no, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get sued. I don't want to. How sad is our world that that's the first thing people go to? How sad is that? Like, honestly, I want you to I understand it, but I also want to fight it. Okay. We need to talk about this because it is one of the most misunderstood concepts in first aid. And it varies, and I'm not a lawyer and whatever, but it varies state to state, but most states have something like a Good Samaritan law. In my state, that law says, Any person who renders first aid or emergency assistance at the scene of a motor vehicle crash on any street or highway to any person injured as a result of the accident shall not be liable in civil damages or any acts or for any acts or omissions relating to the services rendered unless the acts or omissions amount to wanton conduct or intentional wrongdoing. So, if there's some injured person and I walk up and stab them, then they would probably hold that against me.
What a dick.
If there's an injured person and I do CPR and it doesn't work, then no harm done from a liability standpoint, right? Where this gets a little squishy is when I try to get creative away from my training, right? So I have first aid training. Does that mean I should try to do a surgical airway on some car wreck
Jim's
victim?
out there criking people.
Yeah, so I bust out my Benchmade folder out of my pocket.
The elderly lady's like, "Sir, that hurts." Ma'am, I'm trying to help. Hold still.
I'm like, hold still. I watched a YouTube video once.
Saw this on MASH.
Yeah. So like, generally speaking, if you're working within the scope of your training and you're doing fundamentally what you know or believe to be right, the liability concern goes way, way, way down. So go get training. Know what you can do, right? And if we're being honest, the second I saw the kid bleeding, it wasn't a choice. Like I wasn't going to sit there and be like, whoa, what about the liability? What about the Good Samaritan law? I was just like, there's a kid hurt. I'm going to go help the kid, right? Because I'm a human. And that takes priority over all this other shit. Okay? But it's important to understand, like, I was not keyed up for this event. I was drinking my coffee. I was listening to a podcast about security force assistance in Ukraine, because it's the kind of thing I do. And you don't get to pick the day. And that's one of my favorite sayings, right? You don't get to pick the day you're going to have to do all this stuff you've been trained for. So I get out of my car. I try to help out. First thing I fucked up was I failed to do that scene size up off the bat. I could see what I saw, right? Like in some sense, I did have a scene size up. The sedan was the more damaged of the two vehicles, right? It was the one that was upside down and all jacked up. And I walked up to the mom, who was walking around with the bleeding kid, and I said, "Is there anyone else in the car?" And she's just wandering around this scene. And she said, "Yes." So my priority turned to that car. I stopped and I'm like, we're going to sort out that car. 2020 hindsight, I should have looked into the pickup truck as well. It looked less damaged. And it looked like the driver was out in front of it, but should have known better. So I look in the car and I don't see anyone. But it took a couple minutes because there was a kid and there was a car seat. And I think there were 2 car seats and like I couldn't find the other kid. And that was unsettling. And I had to push the airbag out of the way and I had to kind of move some glass out of the way. But I had to spend that extra couple minutes of searching this relatively small car because mom said yes. Right? And I'm looking for little people. I didn't even think to look around for an ejected victim. Remember when we talked about the multiple collisions in a crash? If kid's not belted in, and there's no guarantee the kid was belted in, that kid might be 30 yards away, right?
Also, when we talk about the pin man thing, the mechanism of injury stuff, consider that the amount of force it takes to throw someone from a car is significant. So if you did find a patient who was ejected from the car, that should raise your awareness and your suspicion quite a bit.
One note, I didn't bother calling 911 for a lot of reasons. One was there were 200 drivers behind me, and I figured at least one of them was doing that already. I tore up my hands a little bit checking the car. Remember I talked about the broken glass? I carry gloves in my car, but I didn't think to glove up. So I tore up my hands a little bit.
And different kinds of gloves, right? There's like work gloves, and then there's like personal protective gloves for like bloodborne pathogens.
Yep. So the mom, she was wandering clearly dazed. She was banged up. The toddler was banged up, carrying this kid around in her arms. She's looking for her purse. She's like walking around the scene looking for her purse. Was she was in some psychological shock over the crash, right? Both were probably concussed, right? Their brains had banged their skulls. I told her to sit down because she was walking through the middle of the accident. She didn't. She just kept wandering around looking for her purse. And then that presents a dilemma. Do I set her down? Well, probably not. I'm probably not going to jujitsu the mom carrying the kid. But at the same time, like, there's cars trying to, drive around this scene. So I walked up to the pickup truck. I was going to go size it up. And that's when I heard the sirens. So I knew help was close, right? And I could ultimately go back to my car. One of the things that really stood out to me as someone who doesn't respond to crashes a lot was it was really loud. All of the car alarms were going off. And then the fire truck, as it got closer, it had its siren on and it never turned off its siren. It just stayed loud. And so I'm like shouting at the mom and she's trying to shout at me. And there's like the fog and friction of just the noise. You have to be louder than the scene. And that's a thing you've got to be prepared to do, right?
There's an emotional side of this too. There's a paper that went out, the RAND Corporation. I've talked about it before. They did a whole study on battlefield airmen and like a bunch of special operations stuff, talking about human performance under stress. And one of the things they talked about in terms of environmental factors that induce higher levels of stress that affect performance, and one was extreme temperature extremes, so super hot, super cold, and another one was noise, loud noise. In terms of that, like adrenaline, like we talk about when the adrenaline hits, you lose 100 IQ points, right? Mm-hmm. All that. Loud noise like that will make things more stressful. And obviously for the people, it's one thing to know that for the people there and affected by it if you're observing it, but also just within yourself. If you're trying to make decisions and you're like, God damn, like if you feel kind of panicked and kind of rushed and kind of stressed out and it's loud, like it might be worth physically taking a step back to actually recognize that, like, all right, I need to like regulate this a little bit, and a little bit of quiet environment might be better, right?
Yeah. Side note, building fire alarms. They're designed to be so loud that you can't ignore them, right? Like that's a feature, not a flaw. So the other cars on the road were immediately a factor. Like at first there was the sudden stop. Oh, there's a wreck in front of me, right? And I'm in the habit, because of where I live and how I drive, of I always mash the hazard lights if I'm going to stop suddenly. I want the car behind me to see, hey, something's up, right? And then I used my car to kind of block the road in my direction, or coming from my direction, going toward the wreck until the fire trucks got there. Immediately, cars on the opposite side were driving over the wreckage debris to continue down the road. They did not want to deal with this, right? The whole time while mom was wandering the scene with the toddler. Now, to be fair to the opposing traffic, I at least thought about it for a second or two, just driving through it or around it, but I didn't. Another note, I recently tossed out an old instant cold compress pack that I kept in the car. It just, it got old. It was clearly not going to work anymore, but I didn't replace it. In the future, I want to restock that. I would have given it to mom, mostly to give her something to do while the trucks rolled, right? Help is coming. It's going to take a minute or two. Here's something to do. Here, put this ice pack against your kid's head. I didn't do that. The cut on the kid's head from a distance was superficial enough that I didn't feel like I needed to like do something about it, right? I have tourniquets and stuff, but I'm not going to tourniquet a head. And I'm not trained or equipped. Attitude. Yeah, can do anything once. And I'm not trained or equipped to sort out pediatric brain trauma, right? That's outside of the scope of my training. So an ice pack is honestly probably about the best I can do for a lot of things. And so consider that. Like if you're picking and choosing what to keep in your car, that might be a thing. Maybe that instead of an AR-15. So, which is only relevant in a couple of zombie scenarios. Given geography, where this wreck was,
so many of those, you know.
yeah. Got to be ready. Given geography, like where this wreck took place, I knew help was relatively close by. I wasn't 100 miles from nowhere. I was 5 miles from nowhere. I would have changed my approach if we were out in the boonies. I would have been a much more take charge kind of participant. Speaking of geography, given that I drive a lot, and I use Google to navigate on my phone, right? I think most people do, especially because I'm always someplace new. I rarely know what road I'm on. Like, I rarely know the name of the road or how far down that road I'm on. What mile marker am I by? I try to pay attention to that, but if we're being honest, I don't. So if I had called 911, the location I would have given them would have been garbage. I would have been like, I'm on the road to the airport. They'd be like,
Cool.
thanks. Cool story, bro. Right? So consider there are like 3 or more good ways to check your location on Google Maps before you call 911. That's probably worth like rehearsing. Like, do you know how to pull up, what's my nearest cross street or what's my location? There are ways to do it, but you got to like teach your finger how to get there.
Well, I think, and some of that is a matter of being proactive and always thinking about where you're at, right? Like, this is something that when I train new cops, it's, when the thing happens in front of you, you don't get to like stop and pull up a map. Like, you got to call it out. You need to already know where you're at. And there's a couple things in here. So we mentioned like assuming that other people were calling in, which can be true, but also all those people can be assuming the same thing, right? Like, if we assume that the 200 cars behind us called 911 and they all assume the same thing and then no one calls in, that's problematic, right? The other is you might be able to give better information than some of them to include the location, right? Also, Jim talked about knowing where he was and that help was not that far away. I think that is something that can shape your decision-making in terms of things like I mentioned earlier, which is maybe you're not actually rendering care, but if it's getting clothes off, getting people out of the car, co-locating people, because you recognize that like, hey, I'm not necessarily going to be the
Lone Ranger in this.
Right. Yeah. Like that there's other stuff that I can do that can help facilitate and speed up the transfer of care that will happen to get these people to help. Right. And related to the geography thing, location is one thing, but access is another. So if you say I'm at Interstate X at whatever road, that's fine. It gets people in the ballpark, right? But if you tell them that I am east or west of that exit, so you need to come from the exit before or after, right? And facing which direction, that is also something that can speed up that whole transfer, because saying that I'm at, Interstate 10 and Main Street, but then when I get on the freeway coming from one direction and I see you on the other side of the freeway, I got to go to the next exit, get off, turn around, come back. Versus if I knew that ahead of time, I might be able to change my route. So being specific about giving those locations, I think, goes a long way. And really the only way, it's one thing if, like Jim said, you pull up a map and you're able to like articulate that in a certain way. But what will really help is if you're just constantly paying attention to where you're at and how you would get there, I think is the key.
Yeah. Another note off this, it usually only takes one person getting out of their car to give other people the social psych permission to get out of their car. And so I get out of my car. Shortly thereafter, a lady in scrubs showed up. So I assumed she was going to go help the humans that were out of their car.
Yeah. So It's a funny thing. Well-meaning, I'm sure, for people in scrubs in most cases. But there is a thing that I think is also worth noting in all of this, which is kind of just a side topic, I guess. I had a conversation recently with someone about one of those scenarios where, like, on an airline, they were like, is there a doctor or a nurse on board? And it was for some guy that was having a seizure. So totally appropriate, right? And it's interesting and kind of funny because most, like, actual doctors and arguably most actual nurses, that's not something that they really, like, they're smart, right? I'm not taking away from what they do for a living or anything like that, but that's not their wheelhouse. Like, that is not the sort of thing that they deal with out in an austere environment like that, where they have no tools, no resources, no whatever. They might more or less know what they're looking at, but they don't necessarily have a lot to manage it or do with it. And I'm not saying that there's not anything, that there's something wrong with that practice of, like, is there a doctor or a nurse on board? But just consider how different those jobs are from, like, EMT, paramedic, firefighter, something like that, who deal with that on a regular basis out in the field with not a lot of resources. I just think it's kind of interesting. When we talk about personalities and aptitude for managing a crisis, it's a very different thing to be in the field, in field conditions, like out in the street somewhere with limited resources in the dark and all of that, versus, like, when I bring you someone neatly packaged on a gurney in fluorescent lighting. There are different personalities at play in that, and I just think you should just consider the challenges accordingly. So, food for that.
There's also I have no idea what that person in scrubs is.
That's like, and that's kind of where
they could be the hospital janitor.
They could be a phlebotomist, right? They could, like, do blood draws for a living and really know nothing about. Like, they might have a CPR card at best. Like,
yeah. So, but, she seemed enthusiastic and was headed toward the humans, and I'm like, that's cool. You got that. I'm going to do something else. Pretty shortly after that, the fire truck did roll up, and I directed their attention to the kid, because I thought the kid was the most serious situation, and I went on my way. As I was driving away, I noticed my hands were bleeding like crazy. And it was, like, pretty obvious to me.
Your hands or your hands were bleeding?
Good question. So at first I was, there's blood on my hands. And I looked more carefully, and I had the glass cuts all over my hands because I had tried to get into the upside down car, right? But I wasn't 100% sure that it was my blood. And I was like, man, I should put on some hand sanitizer, which we have a crap ton of in my wife's car. I didn't keep it in my car. So I drove for another hour until I could go wash my hands. It's probably my blood. So in this event, was this some, crazy hero situation? No, it wasn't. I didn't exactly save the day. I didn't do a whole lot of anything, honestly. But you don't always have to. What I tried to do was be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And in this case, it was enough. Everybody lived. The professional responders showed up. I did take some lessons from it. And I think that penman thing that Mike brings up is useful. And I think it's useful whether you're a civilian or a cop or a EMT or paramedic. I think there are ways you could apply it differently based on your role. But I think that is a starting point. And I should stock hand sanitizer and an instant cold pack in my car. There was a time when I carried a bunch of other stuff in my car, the zombie kit, and I used to carry like a what is it? Like half crowbar, half hammer, like a
oh, I know what you're talking about.
Demolition hammer. Because I thought I might need to extricate someone, but it occurred to me I didn't have it strapped down very well, and if I stopped suddenly, I was going to catch that thing in the back of the head. So I don't drive with it anymore because I didn't have a good enough lashing system. That has also gotten better in my car. I think that's all I got. Big thing from my perspective is you need to be able to read a scene. you can intervene. You're probably not going to get sued. And the time to prepare is now. There's like, when we think about all the scenarios, all the shooting and, what you need your AR-15 for, and, do you need to put a can on it, or, do you want a long range scope or short range scope? Like that's good. And I like that stuff too. But which thing are you more likely to see, a car wreck or all that other stuff? And I would offer you're probably going to see a car wreck because you live in America and you drive a car, right?
I think one thing we probably didn't emphasize enough in the front end of this is the location piece, especially as it relates to access. Like there's the location, but also how do you get to how do people get to me is a big part of it.
Yep.
Penman, I think, is useful when it comes to scene size up stuff, and the reason that I bring all that up is because when it comes to managing, having participated in a number of clusterfucks over the course of my career, what I've noticed is like if you get off on the right foot, things go a lot better, right? And so that scene size up, if you have a very clear assessment of what's happening and what needs to happen next, you get off on the right foot in that sense and things go a lot better, right? And so that is something I think that a first responder, the first people on scene to one of these things, whether it's fire, EMS, law enforcement, or just the private citizen that rolls up on this thing, or maybe is even involved in this kind of thing, if you're able to communicate those things and to have a clear picture, you're a lot more likely to mitigate some of those like adverse, secondary outcomes that can otherwise be avoided. A lot of times in car wrecks, like the damage is done, right? Now you're just cleaning. You're playing cleanup. But if you're able to get ahead of the response, that goes a long way. So Penman, personal and personnel safety, environmental hazards, number of patients, mechanism of injury, need for additional resources, and need for extrication. Penman. That's all I got.
Sweet. Drive safe.
Yeah.
Out.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.